When they were born, they had no idea what their futures would hold.
The twins aren't safe together. The darkness won't rest until it finds them.
Door open.
Bring home Tia and Tamira Mori.
Go Twitches, go Twitches. As it gets.
Twitches, now on Disney DVD.
Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the DCOM review, and boy does it feel great to be back. I missed you guys. After months of tiny references here and there throughout several videos, we finally get to dive into one of the best DCOMs ever made. Next time. But this time around, we're taking a closer look at the twin sister-centered film of 2005, because for one reason or another, everyone here seems to want my full take on it, and I'm nothing if not a man of the people. You asked for it, so, for better or worse, you're all getting it. It bears mentioning that this won't exactly be an overly positive review, so if you really like or love this movie, you've been warned. But if you're open to hearing a very critical perspective on it, then stick around. With all that said, let's dive into Twitches and finally get this over with. So, we kick things off with everyone's favorite cocktail of movie blunders, clunky expositional narration, bad-looking CGI even for 2005, and completely lifeless acting. And that's just the first 2 minutes. How much longer is this? So here we get Ileana and Karsh, two characters from another dimension called Coventry, which is a land supposedly filled with all sorts of enchantment, magic, and mystery. I say supposedly because this movie inexplicably decides to not show much of Coventry itself. They save two twin babies from a force of evil called the Darkness. Wow, they really swung for the fences with that name. So we're introduced to the lead characters of Alex and Cameron, portrayed by the famous twin Mori sisters of Tia and Tamara, which some of you older viewers might remember from their sitcom Sister Sister. Tia's character of Alex represents the moon, so of course, she has to be dim, dour, bleak, and be the one to not only lose a parent, as we learn later on, but also live in a less ideal circumstance compared to Cameron. Cameron, on the other hand, lives in a dream world where she can be as uppity, hyperactive, attention deficit, and privileged as she well pleases, because she represents the sun. Lord almighty, these twin characterizations are so lazy that the Sprouse twins are laughing at them. So it's both of their birthdays and Halloween too for no real reason. I don't know, maybe they hoped a better movie would somehow rub off on them, and they eventually meet. Ileana and Karsh from before finally reveal themselves after 21 years, and what exactly were they waiting for? Karsh uses magic to create a completely contrived situation for the twins to meet, but why intervene now? The darkness was always present and always getting stronger. It would have made a lot more sense to have them meet sooner and train together, way before the darkness grew strong enough to be a viable threat, as is proven in the later stages of this movie. But in any case, they meet and become walking, talking exposition robots for the next 20 or so minutes. I always say this generally accept the truth about filmmaking. Show, don't tell. And so far, this film is so bloated on exposition that I don't feel like I'm watching a movie. I feel like I'm listening to an audiobook with the Mori twins walking around for almost the entire length of your average TV show, and when Ileana and Karsh are around, they're only present to dispense more exposition. All four of them keep talking on and on and on about Coventry, and honestly, learning about the lore did make me want to experience more of what that world was, but the movie, whether through too low a budget or bad screenplay, regrettably decides to show almost none of that dimension, or any of the other 9.5 dimensions that apparently exist according to them. I mean seriously, 9.5 dimensions? Who wrote the script, a 7-year-old? These filmmakers seriously thought that Cameron's generic rich girl Halloween party would be so much more captivating than a land of freaking magic. That's a brand new level of dumb. Now, to be fair, this movie does show a little bit in the form of a backstory, but that's something they could have easily included in the beginning of the movie, as directly opposed to dragging out the runtime by showing us the same scene again with minor differences, while also ripping off the whole infants are loved thing from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. In any case, they start learning about their powers and using them for all manner of hijinks because that somehow seems responsible to them. These aren't children we're dealing with here either. These are young adults, and they flaunt around their powers so brainlessly. There's a reason why in the Harry Potter universe, magic was more or less a no-no in the Muggle world, and it made sense. If the Muggle world knew about this stuff, then there would be all kinds of problems, and from their continued use of magical powers, they eventually refer to themselves as Twitches. Now, I fully recognize complaining about their name of all things is a very, very minor grievance in the grand scheme of things, but I can't really help it. It's just so annoying to me. And then we have the Darkness, who's apparently this big force of pure evil, just casually floating around, being about as menacing as a box of freaking toothpicks before it actually decides to do something. So, it chases around the twins escape, the Darkness essentially calls it a day. So the twins are back in Coventry with Mr. and Mrs. Exposition themselves, but Cameron is having a hissy fit because the Darkness, a force of pure evil that she knew was pure evil, ends up doing the one thing she already knew it would do. Are you actually kidding me right now? If there's one thing I take more offensively than almost anything else, it's people who assume that everything should come easy and automatically quit when working a bit harder becomes the only viable option. She was fine with being a witch when it meant fun and games, but now that the evil is here, nope, gotta get my party on. And the only reason she comes back to help fight the darkness later on was because the darkness came to her party to try and finish the job, meaning that if the darkness had just attacked Coventry first and saved Cameron for later, these so-called protagonists would have lost. It's honestly just really deplorable character design. Before I forget about this pretty forgettable character, let's talk about Thantos, a man so obviously evil from the opening gun that they didn't even need that heavily contrived picture of him to prove he was up to no good. I realize I didn't give my typical spoiler warning prior to getting into the plot, but there's really nothing to spoil with this movie because everything is so brutally obvious in direction. So surprising absolutely nobody, Thantos ends up being the darkness, after Alex and eventually Cameron meet up with their biological mother Miranda, who always looks perpetually bored for no discernible reason. So they call out Thantos and they fight the obnoxious dark puffball he becomes. This so-called climax is about as boring as the one from Up, Up and Away, but slightly more inspired. That is to say, it was inspired by the most cliche power there is. Somebody phone up Huey Lewis and the news because guess what ends up beating this silly smoke cloud? So in a movie that's literally an hour and a half plus of exposition and cliches, they end it with the most generic cliche they could think of. Obviously nobody really dies because this movie has zero stakes, making any tension non-existent, and then the twins go back to Earth to finish off their ridiculously lengthy birthday. And now, the characters. Most of the minor or supporting characters have little to no screen time or screen presence. Cameron's parents don't really feel like actual parents, and Miranda and Thantos are just sort of there. Miranda has one cool moment, and that's about it. Other than that, her screen time doesn't really amount to much other than, oh my god, my kids are alive, and her rather lifeless expressions can't even get that right. But Thantos just might be one of the worst villains Disney Channel has ever created. His evil intentions were so obvious from the very beginning because he was so terrible at pretending to be a good guy. All of his lines felt so forced and clunky, like Patrick Fabian just didn't know how to portray what Stuart Gillard wanted him to. Admittedly, it would have been a difficult role for most actors to pull off, but that doesn't change my stance on him. His darkest powers were so inconsistent. Sometimes they set things on fire, sometimes they didn't, and he was nothing more than a giant puff of smoke most of the time, which completely saps away any chance he had at being a potentially captivating villain. With a bit more screen time, better explanations of his motivations instead of just forcing them down our throats, in addition to a more fleshed out backstory, could have gone a long way, instead of just watching him look clueless as to how to properly convey a villain trying to hide his evil side. Patrick Fabian also played the dad in Cloud 9, which makes sense, because both characters put no thought into their plans. Here he's just wandering around aimlessly half the time, and instead of trying to cultivate a coherent plan, he just keeps trying to lie his way out of things until the final few scenes where he gets caught, and then does a grand total of nothing before getting beaten pretty easily. Seriously, the Care Bears could have beaten this guy. Heck, I'm not even sure he had a plan at all. It felt like he was winging it half the time, and he never seemed to have any real control of the situation, except keeping Miranda off his scent for a little while. And unlike How to Build a Better Boy, which also had laughably terrible villains, the villains in that movie were never major parts of the plot, but the entirety of Twitches revolves around stopping this one guy, and everything about said guy felt phoned in here. Ilyana and Karsh, on the other hand, do have their moments. They feel more like cartoon characters than live-action characters most of the time, but that isn't always a bad thing. Their banter can be legitimately funny, and a lot of it is pretty well written in addition to acted. But it is a little few and far between for me, because a sizable chunk of the film has them serving as nothing more than expositional tools to help fill everyone in on the what, the who, and the why as they pretend to different plot points. I'd call Karsh my favorite character from both Twitches movies, but honestly that's not saying too much. But for what it's worth, I got enough laughs out of this crazy pair that I feel like their overall inclusion was done well enough. This brings us to the twins themselves. Let's start with the positives first. The real-life sisters of Tia and Tamara Mori play off each other really well. It certainly helps that a lot of the TV shows and movies they've done to this point have also been together. You would expect them to have sister chemistry, and they definitely deliver that here. And it produces some genuinely good moments, because unsurprisingly, it comes naturally to them. But unfortunately, as individual characters, they have a ton of shortcomings. Alex is not exactly a pleasant person and takes out her frustrations on those who care about her quite a bit, including one scene in particular where she viciously insults and never apologizes to her best friend, who took her in after her mother died. That's pretty low, but outside of that, there's nothing terribly memorable about Alex as an individual either. However, I do give her some credit for still wanting to face the darkness, even after she realized how much of a threat it could be, as directly opposed to Cameron, who handled all of that in as off-putting way as possible. Needless to say, I'm not a fan of Cameron. I have zero issues with characters who are lively, a bit zany, and more happy-go-lucky than most. In fact, a lot of my favorite characters from Disney Channel alone share that description. But, ironically enough, the most excitable character is also kind of the most boring, because she gets excited by everything. And when she's not getting excited, she's abandoning her sister and her entire other homeworld just to party it up. Now, to her credit, she does end up feeling bad about all that, but the way it plays out makes that change of heart seem more inspired by not wanting to upset her adoptive mother, because Miranda is her biological mother, versus actually wanting to stop the darkness until the darkness invades her party, and now all of a sudden, she's not afraid anymore. It's one of the most disingenuous character transformations I've ever seen in a DCOM. What the movie should have done is taken a page from Cowbells. Yes, seriously. It's also a movie that isn't very good, but the change from privileged to generous that Ali Mishalka's character goes through actually functions well, at least relative to what we get here. And that's Twitches. So, what's the verdict? Twitches is not a good movie at all, but to be fair, I can admit that my at times comically negative views against it leading up to this review were a bit overblown. It's like I said in my top 5 worst DCOMs video, this movie isn't that offensive, and the more I thought about it versus the movies that did make that list, the more that sentiment became clear to me. However, that having been said, I still think Twitches is a bad movie for several reasons. Let's start with the good. The film does well to convey an interesting world within a parallel dimension, but I'll soon get into why that point is actually a double-edged sword. The sisters work well together for the most part, and the pair of Karsh and Ileana have some nice scenes. The score is also solid as well, really capturing the spirit of what they were going for. And now, the bad stuff, of which there is unfortunately a lot. The cast is poor in most areas that actually matter to the movie, and are portrayed either so lifelessly that they basically aren't even there, or so vapidly that you wish they weren't. Karsh in this movie is kind of like James Avery, aka Uncle Phil, in You Lucky Dog, in the sense that both characters are trying their best to cope with an unideal situation surrounding him. But everyone, including him on rare instances, has more than a handful of moments where you really question what was going through their heads. The biggest culprit of which is still Mr. Stormcloud himself, who is somehow less effective with his so-called plans than Draken on his worst day. But unlike Draken, he's not funny, charming, engaging, or even that intelligent, and being even one of those things could have salvaged so much about this movie. But even that wasn't as disappointing as the singular systemic flaw that really just breaks this movie for me. There was so much talk of Coventry, saving Coventry, drawing Coventry, gotta go back to Coventry, Coventry is in danger, and none of it amounts to anything. That's the double-edged sword I was talking about. I actually enjoyed hearing about Coventry to an extent, but it would have made a literal world of difference to actually allow us to experience more of the world that the Super Twins are trying to save. If we had that experience, there would have been a greater sense of stakes once the final battle rolls around, but Coventry is pretty much empty except for Miranda and Thantos. It's a world of magic and mysticism, but all we ever get are teases to what could lie beyond the castle setting, but we never see it. It's less of a movie and more of a dramatic reading through several scenes. It hurts to watch because it's another example of a movie that could have been good or even great in theory, but the decisions made during its conception were just mind-boggling. It's easy to see how one change here or there could have made this entire endeavor a lot more passable at the very least, but what we get is kind of a mess. It's not to say that this movie doesn't have enjoyable moments, and if you're coming in as a fan of the Mari sisters, that just might be enough to carry you through. After all, some people enjoyed Zapped because of Zendaya, even though that movie was horrible, broken, and far, far worse than this one. All in all, Twitches is by no means the worst DCOM I've ever seen, but given its director and its concept, it had the potential to be something much, much greater than what we got. So much about this movie doesn't work within its own narrative and underrepresents the entire idea of a magical dimension while being almost exclusively about said dimension. I mean, seriously, does nobody else live in Coventry? Where is everybody? Are you seriously telling me they couldn't even grab a few cheap extras and dress them in some generic otherworldly garbs? That would have at least been something. Adding to that is the fact that some elements inherent to this film just plain make no sense, and considering that this is the same guy who would go on to beautifully direct Avalon High a few years after Twitches, if nothing else, he learned from his mistakes. It kinda goes without saying that I wouldn't personally recommend this film, but after having now seen it 3 different times at 3 different points in my life, and having made an entire review for it, I can honestly say that this movie, similar to Starstruck, is just a little bit better than the other times I watched it. It'll never be one of my favorites, but hopefully after watching this review, you can kind of understand why I think that way, even if you don't agree, which is fair. So, in the spirit of fairness, I'll cap this review by saying, the only way to know for sure is to give it a watch and decide for yourself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and throw it on a like, sub for more, and share the magic everywhere. And don't forget to follow the Disney Brain on Facebook and Twitter for updates, links down below. And don't worry guys, the next video won't take 2 weeks to get here. Those complications are hopefully behind us. Next up, we'll be counting down the top 10 best DCOM lead performances, and then we're finally going to take a closer look at one of the all-time greats in Avalon High. And after that, the Girl Meets World reviews will be back, so lots to look forward to. Until then...
Why would you do that? You just double-dipped. Well, now you've ruined the whole bowl. Please, just... Disgusting.